Welcome to the Random Bytes podcast, available on Spreaker.com, iTunes, Google Play, and just added to iHeartRadio. A new podcast every day featuring interviews and a unique take on the world we live in. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Random Bytes. Here is your host, Alan Wayne. Tom Grant was a retired private investigator and former detective with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. This is from CobaincAce.com, www.CobaincAce.com. Tom Grant writes, Kurt Cobain left a drug rehab center in Marina del Rey, California on April 1st, 1994, and was later reported missing. As you probably know, he was found dead just 7 days later. On April 3, 1994, while conducting business as a California state licensed private investigator, Tom Grant was hired by Courtney Love, the spouse of Kurt Cobain, who was in Los Angeles at the time, to locate her husband after he had left a drug rehab center in Marina del Rey, California. Miss Love stayed in Los Angeles while Mr. Grant flew to Seattle in search for Cobain with his best friend Dylan Carlson. In fact, Carlson and I had been in the Cobain residence the night before Kurt's body was discovered in the room above the garage. The police immediately concluded suicide. Tom wasn't so sure. Neither was Rosemary Carroll, Courtney Love's own entertainment attorney, Miss Carroll, who was a close friend to both Courtney and Kurt. They both knew there was something terribly wrong here. After several months of intense investigation, including dozens of taped interviews with Cobain's closest friends and family members, Mr. Grant reached the conclusion that Courtney Love and Michael DeWitt, the male nanny who lived at the Cobain residence, were involved in a conspiracy that resulted in the murder of Kurt Cobain. It appears this was not the first attempt on Cobain's life by Courtney Love, however, it was obviously the first to succeed. In December of 1994, Mr. Grant began speaking publicly about the suspicious circumstances surrounding Cobain's death. Facing the potential consequences of exposure, Courtney Love, her wealthy and powerful friends, her attorneys, and the symbiotic, quote, rock press, end quote, have engaged in an effort to keep the public from learning the true facts about Kurt's death. These are people who are motivated by profit rather than truth. Courtney's attorneys have consistently threatened those in various media outlets with, quote, potential lawsuits if these journalists were to give Mr. Grant a platform from which to discuss his investigation of the Cobain case. And as he had predicted when he first began telling the public about the details of his investigation more than 21 years ago, no legal, criminal, or civil action has ever been taken against Mr. Grant or anyone in the media who has covered this story. In spite of the hot air they've been blowing all these years, the investigation has reached coverage in hundreds of major newspapers, magazines, television, and radio talk shows around the globe, including this one. The pathetic cowards of this world can only blow smoke. Once they've been exposed, they run and hide. The events surrounding the death of Kurt Cobain are filled with lies, contradictions in logic, and countless inconsistencies. That's page 1 of the report. Now, I will say that I saw the documentary that accompanies this case, and the documentary was extremely convincing. The way the documentary was produced was it was actors portraying Kurt Cobain, Courtney Love, everyone else, and playing out this scenario of events that Mr. Grant had unfolded and had exposed. And it all made sense. Who had the most to gain from Kurt Cobain's death? Some would say Dave Grohl, but Dave Grohl is a wonderful man. Dave Grohl is, now granted, not above suspicion, but Dave Grohl is, I believe, not the type of person to carry out something like this. Dave Grohl did profit huge from the death of Kurt Cobain, for he went on to start his own band, Foo Fighters, and has become a legend in his own right. Whereas Kurt Cobain's massive shadow was keeping the talents of Dave Grohl in the dark. Courtney Love, on the other hand, why would she have a reason to kill Kurt Cobain? She had everything because of him. She had her music career because of him. She had fame and notoriety because of him. Why should she kill him? Nobody really knows what goes on behind closed doors in a marriage. Nobody really knows the stories except those two, and one of them ain't talking. Actually, both ain't talking. All I know is that Courtney Love has been able to live quite comfortably through many years on the work of her husband. And some would say that that is a insurance scam, if indeed it was called to be murder. It would be an insurance scam. Because in the end, she owns the rights to Nirvana's catalog. A catalog that is still very, very popular and still generating quite a bit of income, I bet. Apocalypse in the chat room says he tried to commit suicide many times prior and was a depressed loner. And Mr. DJT in the chat room says, yeah, but he was going to get rid of her. There were court papers. There was discussion about a divorce. There was a discussion about divorce that they were going to separate because, well, Kurt was a moody bastard anyway. I mean, read any book on him. He was very moody, and he was very, very sad, and he was very, I guess you could say, depressed all the time. Many reasons for that. He had terrible stomach ulcers, which he assuaged with heroin. He had numerous different ailments, his back, his body. He was a fairly weak person physically. And he always put himself 110% out there on the stage. So it wasn't a shock to people that Kurt Cobain killed himself. It wasn't this huge shock. I mean, it was very sad. It was very sad that Kurt Cobain took his own life, but it wasn't shocking, which makes this whole idea that he was murdered even more interesting. Because you have several people who point out all the problems, and the problems that Mr. Cobain had were well publicized. Kurt Cobain was on the outs with Nirvana. Kurt Cobain was on the outs with his wife. I mean, he was on the outs with many different people. He just wanted to be left alone. He didn't want to deal with all of this celebrity, and that's been well documented. But it's still intriguing to think that a man with so much to live for and so much to aspire to and so much fame and fortune would take his own life, and in such a violent way. It almost doesn't add up. The case continues. Here is some of what you were never told. And, as alluded to earlier, Courtney Love was facing a divorce. Kurt was in the process of leaving Seattle and his wife Courtney when he was found dead. Courtney knew Kurt wanted out of the marriage. Just weeks prior to his death, she asked one of her attorneys to get the, quote, meanest, most vicious divorce lawyer, end quote, she could find. Now, if Courtney Love went that route, she would have most definitely been in for a fight, or Kurt might have just given up and taken off. Knowing the way Kurt was, he might have just given up and taken off. But it's still very interesting to know that Courtney was looking for the meanest, most vicious divorce lawyer she could find. Next point, someone was using Kurt's credit card. One of Kurt's credit cards was missing when his body was discovered. Someone was attempting to use the missing credit card after Kurt Cobain died, but the attempt stopped when his body was discovered. Now that's interesting. I mean, when a person is dead, they obviously cannot use their own credit card. Especially back in 1994, where we weren't as technologically advanced as we are today. What with the internet and automatic bill pay and things like that, we were not as advanced. For the most part, you used your credit card at the point of sale, which would mean somebody would have to use the credit card. Somebody would have to be in possession of the credit card and hand it to the clerk or whoever was taking the payment, or whatever machine was taking the payment, and operate it in order to complete a transaction. Kurt obviously couldn't do that with most of his head spilled out of his neck. So, Cobain was in fear of his life, is the next point. The shotgun found at the scene was purchased before Cobain left for rehab in Los Angeles, not after he fled the rehab, as reported by misinformed media sources. So it was purchased before, which would lead some to believe that it was purchased for protection and not for suicide, although we'd never know. By the way, the film that I'm speaking about, the documentary, the 2-hour documentary, was called Soaked in Bleach. It's available on Netflix and Amazon.com. It's a fine, fine film. If anybody out there listening is a fan of Nirvana or just wants to know what happened, take a trip down memory lane and watch this movie. It's a great movie. The shotgun was fully loaded with 3 shells. It was purchased and loaded for protection, not suicide. Welcome, Stabby McHugs, to the chat room. Thank you for tuning in. The police claim there was no legible fingerprints on this shotgun. There were no legible fingerprints on this shotgun. When you have to operate a shotgun, if anyone's ever operated a shotgun, especially a heavy gauge shotgun, there needs to be pressure that is applied to that trigger. That will obviously leave a print. So, if somebody were to pull the trigger and shoot themselves, especially if rigor set in, there'd be prints all over the place. Wouldn't there? There'd be prints all over the place. And there'd be prints all over the scene. But no. No prints whatsoever. The truth is, the shotgun wasn't even checked for fingerprints until May 6th, nearly 1 month after Cobain's body was found. What? Now, okay, if you watch Soaked in Bleach, you will see that the Seattle Police Department botched this investigation completely and utterly botched this investigation. It was as though they had their minds set on suicide, and that is all that they would listen to, and that is all that they would even reason to be there, was a suicide. It is as though the Seattle Police Department turned a blind eye to all of the evidence, or they were just lazy. They figured that Mr. Cobain was depressed. He was one of these Hollywood types. His problems were well documented. So, they figured, I mean, even Darren in the chat room says, welcome Darren, it's because he tried 2 weeks earlier. Well, because someone tries 2 weeks earlier and then tries again, I mean, or tries to commit suicide 2 weeks earlier and then is dead 2 weeks later, it does not mean that they killed themselves. There still needs to be a certain amount of police work that needs to be done. The police are there to investigate every